I wanted to take a moment and talk about Trauma 101 for ostomates. Trauma happens basically when we experience an event as physically or emotionally harmful or even life-threatening. It's essentially our body's ability to cope that becomes overwhelmed. Even though the event passes, trauma has this lasting adverse effect on our mental, physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. We talk as therapists about two types of trauma. Big T trauma, which is some form of single traumatic event, and small t trauma, multiple smaller traumas happening over a period of time that essentially compound on top of each other. A medical diagnosis, difficult surgery, or a medical intervention could be a big T trauma, whereas ongoing health issues could be a compound or small t trauma. Trauma pushes the activation of the nervous system beyond its ability to self-regulate. Harmful or life-threatening events cause the brain to trigger the release of adrenaline, essentially activating that fight or flight response so that we can be prepared to run or to defend ourselves. If our brain perceives that we're in danger, it works hard to get us out. Of course, at times like this, a lot of energy courses through our body. It's important to understand that your fight or flight response is an automatic nervous system response. When a threat is present, our body pauses all of our functions that are involved in the usual rest and digest state. And these physiological changes improve the chances of our survival. For instance, our heart and breathing rate increases, the stress release, cortisol, adrenaline, increased blood pressure, to name a few. It's a total body shift to a threat response state. Now, as long as you can run from the threat or you can fight back, these physiological changes will continue. Once that threat has gone, our body essentially goes back to a state of homeostasis. But when we're caught and we can no longer run or fight, we freeze. Now, this freezing is when our nervous system is too overwhelmed to offer any other solution to survive. This is the point, honestly, where most trauma occurs. When adrenaline is released, the prefrontal cortex in our brain essentially shuts down. So this is the part of the brain that controls our primary cognitive skills, like emotional expression, memory, problem solving. One of the biggest jobs of the prefrontal cortex is executive functioning, which is involved in decision-making, problem solving, self-control. When this prefrontal cortex goes offline during a threat response, our ability to reason or high reasoning and language stops. We can't reason, think, or articulate well. What happens next is that trauma effectively imprints the stressful event in our brain. The memory of the traumatic event is stored in what we call the amygdala, or our fear brain. And this ensures that we don't find ourselves in these dangerous situations ever again. What's interesting, though, is that the amygdala doesn't save the event as if it was a story. It doesn't put a timestamp or a sequence of events because of the cortisol and the stress response. What the amygdala does is it stores the emotional significance of the traumatic event as experienced by our five senses. So the memory of the trauma is essentially fragments of visual images, smells, sounds, tastes, or touches. Since this traumatic event is stored as a sensory fragment, it can be really hard to verbalize and to attach language to it. So instead, our physical body is what holds our trauma. The traumatic energy of these fragments is stored in our body. And interestingly enough, it can be triggered by a physical or a sensory input that's in some way reminiscent of the trauma. So even though that sensory information that triggers the memory of the traumatic event might be insignificant or even a regular event, the brain misinterprets this trigger as something dangerous, so it responds accordingly. And that's when we get these flashbacks or traumatic memories or trauma experiences. What's confusing, I think, for all of us at times is a psychological phenomenon called repetition compulsion or trauma repetition. This is where we repeat parts of the traumatic events, maybe by replaying it over and over in our minds or by redoing a certain behavior that hurts us. Remember what I said earlier, that freezing is the point where most trauma occurs. Basically, this is when our nervous system is too overwhelmed to offer any other solution to survive. Now, what the brain does with trauma repetition is it recreates history over and over again in an attempt to change the outcome of the story. So the brain is trying to repeat the experience and change the ending. By gaining mastery over what we were unable to control in the original traumatic event, we're able to return to this earlier state, a state where the trauma didn't happen. A reminder, trauma occurs when our nervous system becomes overloaded and we can no longer fight or flee, and we can only freeze. Trauma results from an event that is perceived as threatening, particularly life-threatening. This threat can be real or imagined. Trauma is very individualized, subjective experience. What one person perceives as overwhelming and traumatic may not be so for another. This does not invalidate the experience or the traumatic symptoms that follow. Trauma creates a disconnect between our body and our mind. To find out more about how your illness may have created further trauma in your body, please sign up for my weekly newsletter at www.doclebrock.com/gold.